Now, Rahu and Ketu, these are points of great potency within the birth chart. They show us where we've been, past lifetimes, how we've conditioned our consciousness, where we found success, which is Ketu, and they show what our soul, or our jiva, our individualized self, is aiming to develop in this lifetime, which is Rahu. Now, I've already discussed Rahu and Ketu in regards to the houses in previous videos. So again, on this YouTube channel, just scroll through my old videos until you find, I believe it's Rahu in all the houses and Ketu in all the houses. And for this class, I'll go ahead and include those talks within the playlist. But in this particular talk, we're not going to go into those. We're just going to discuss Rahu and Ketu and their impact within the chart. Now, Rahu and Ketu, they are not planets, physical bodies that reflect light, like Mars or Venus or the moon. They are points in space where eclipses occur. And it's said that they are the areas that indicate where our inner light becomes eclipsed, which makes a lot of sense from a yogic standpoint, because Ketu representing the past, Rahu representing the future, our ambitions. Well, if we weren't concerned about our ambitions and our future, and we weren't focused or obsessed upon our past and where we've been, we wouldn't have to worry about Rahu and Ketu. But living in a human realm, dealing with a human mind, these are things that are useful to understand. Now, wherever Rahu is placed within the chart, it's going to show where in past lifetimes the individualized soul, or you, have very little experience. And I always describe it as though the first time someone rides a bicycle or even a motorcycle, they're terrible at it at first. They fall down, they break a bone, they skin their knees, but they get up and they keep trying until they get the hang of it. So wherever Rahu is placed in the chart, that shows where we naturally don't have these skills, or naturally don't have the capacity to fulfill our destiny in those areas. And that's essentially why we need to know where Rahu is, so that we can focus on that. We can give attention to it. If it's in the 10th house, it could mean that the person doesn't really have many skills, career-oriented wise, or they might feel unsure about their career or have doubts because they've never really done it before. But if they put their attention towards it, they can do very well, assuming Rahu is in good dignity. And how do we determine the dignity of Rahu? Well, we look to Rahu's Lord. If Rahu's in Pisces, we see what the dignity of Jupiter is, and we attribute that to Rahu. We don't use the typical exaltations and debilitations of Rahu and Ketu, because there are so many conflicting texts about where are these planets exalted, where are they debilitated. There's just no way to get a good handle on it if we use these old texts. But what has been found to work is considering the dignity of the lords of Rahu and Ketu. Now, Ketu represents where in past lifetimes we have been, where we have been successful. What have we already conquered? And those are the things we're comfortable with, but that we have to move on from. And that's the difficult part of Ketu, is that if Ketu's in the 5th house, which can show an affinity for children and creativity, well, you do have skills in that department. However, if you try to define yourself this time again through that, you're going to be let down, because Ketu is the liberating aspect of the chart. And our astrological charts aren't meant to tell us what we want to hear, nor is an astrologer meant to do that. And this is the most difficult area within a person's chart, typically, because they will want to fall back on those issues indicated by Ketu. And they will want to still get the same success and the same amount of fulfillment and ego gratification out of it. But Ketu's saying, you have those skills, but now you have to move on. You have to focus on Rahu. Rahu is where you haven't developed yet. That's what you have to look at to round out this individualized self, this jiva, this soul. And that's hard for most people, because they like to focus on those things in which they're comfortable with. Let's imagine the reverse. Let's pretend Ketu's in the 10th. Well, now we have someone who really wants to define themselves through their career or through their activity in the world. They want to feel like they're in their right place, doing the right activity. And Ketu in the 10th is saying, you've already done that. You've already been successful in the outer world. You've already been successful in regards to status. These are just simple examples. But now you need to focus on the 4th house, which is where Rahu would be placed, because they're always opposite each other. So whatever house Rahu is in, Ketu will be in the opposite house. So if Ketu's in the 10th, Rahu will be in the 4th. If Ketu's in the 7th, Rahu will be in the 1st. They're always exactly opposite each other. And someone with Ketu in the 10th will be very upset about this, because they'll remember how good it felt to be successful in the world, to know that they are really contributing something great. And they'll want that, and Ketu will say, no, we're breaking your attachment to it. You can still have a career. You can still be successful in career. But the more you try to define yourself through it, the more unhappy you're going to be. What you need to focus on this time is Rahu in the 4th, which is developing the home, emotional stability, inner contentment, less outward directed things. 10th house is more outward, 4th house is more inward. So these nodes, the Rahu and Ketu, they show that fundamental point within our chart that we're really meant to work through in this life. They're very important. We could do a whole session just on Rahu and Ketu, and that can be the most liberating thing, or it can be the most painful thing, depending on how well you can handle what Rahu and Ketu are meant for you to do. If you're not interested in engaging Rahu and Ketu, then it becomes painful. If you want to rely on Ketu and fall back on all these past skills that you've developed, it becomes painful, because Ketu is the liberator. It's okay to admit that you've been happy and successful in these areas, but he wants you to grow beyond it. He wants you to be a well-rounded individual, which is where Rahu comes into play. Now, in one of the courses that I teach, one of the MP3 download courses, which is my favorite course, is the Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology. And we go into the myths of the planets. So if you want to learn more about Rahu and Ketu, or more about any of the planets, their mythology, so you get a deeper understanding of them, go to AshevilleVedicAstrology.com and take a look at the course, The Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology. It's one of my favorites, and it'll really give you a deep insight into how to work with these planets and how to understand them better. But part of the information that we go over in this course comes from the book Graha Sutras. This is by Ernst Wilhelm. And one of the things I want to cover are the avatars of Rahu and Ketu, because they're very telling in regards to how these planets work. The avatar for Rahu is Varaha. And it's because of Rahu, or Rahu's avatar, Varaha, that we have this world. Everything that's in existence is because of Rahu. And I found that deeply fascinating. Number one, because what's it tell you? Well, Rahu is desire. Rahu is craving. Rahu is that thing that we have to have. And why do we incarnate into this world? Because we have desires, we have cravings, we want to experience certain things. Some of those things we want to experience are good things, wholesome things. Some of those things we want to experience are dark things, terrible things. And how do we know that? Well, just look at society. Look at the movies that society likes to watch. Look at the wars that we have, all the difficulties that we have. It's easy to say that that's just a terrible fluke. But these things occur because part of our consciousness desires them, desires war, desires violence, desires oppression. Seems strange, but we wouldn't experience it if we didn't have that desire. And again, think of the movies we go see. Why do we go see these movies? Not all of us goes to see these movies, but why do we go see these dark movies, or these movies about love affairs and difficulties and such? Because we have a desire inside. And Rahu represents that desire that we have, and that's why we incarnate as an individualized being. Many years ago, as I was reading Vasista's Yoga, I was reflecting on this. In Vasista's Yoga, it says, the way you become liberated is simply by letting go of your desires, your hopes, and your cravings. And again, I chuckled when I read that, because at the time I was a minister, teacher at a meditation center. And I had to laugh because I thought, wow, if I go in and tell people this, no one's ever going to come back to the center, because they don't want to hear that you need to give up your desires, your hopes, and your cravings. Most people go to spiritual groups and things because they have hopes and they have desires to unite with God. And here we have this book saying, just give up all your hopes, your desires, and your cravings, and then you'll be liberated. But the reason I thought this was great was because the night before I was going to give a talk, I was reading Vasista's Yoga, and I had this dream. It was almost a lucid dream. I was conscious during the dream. And I was aware of a point. And from that point, a desire arose. And it was something simple like, I want a dog, a pet dog. And I don't want a pet dog, but that desire arose. And I realized that from that one desire, that I want a pet dog, okay, well, in order to get a pet dog, I have to incarnate first. In order to have a dog, I need to have a job so that I can pay for the dog's food and its vet bills. In order to have a job, I have to relate to my boss. I have to relate to all these other people in my life. I have to have a home to live in. And so this one desire of wanting to have a dog branched out in my mind into these millions of things that had to happen for that one desire to occur. And when I woke up, I was overwhelmed by this feeling of it's exactly right, that desire is that one thing that creates everything else. So you might want just one little thing, but in order for that one little thing to occur, there has to be a world. And I don't remember who said it. There was probably I believe it was a famous scientist. He said, well, if you want to have an apple pie, you have to invent the universe first. So anyway, this idea of Rahu being the basis of why we're all here. I just want to read you a paragraph from this book, Graha Sutras, on the avatar of Rahu. Varaha, the avatar associated with Rahu, was necessary in order to create life on Earth, the physical plane, after the causal and astral planes had been created. Rahu indicates many deeper lessons and desires, and the need to create karmic balance in underdeveloped areas, which make it necessary for us to reincarnate on the physical plane. This is also symbolized by the Earth's salutation as Varaha's wife. When Varaha was raising the earth from the water, an Ashura attacked him. Many demons of phobias, hallucinations, pretensions, confusions, compulsions, and unfounded expectations similarly attack our consciousness as we attempt to develop the areas indicated by Rahu's placement. So this is why Rahu is said to represent phobias and fears, because we're going into the unknown. We're trying to develop parts of us that we don't have any relationship to in the past. So if you're trying to learn a new song, well, that can be daunting, that can be difficult. Can you do it? Is it too hard? That's Rahu. If we're playing a song that we already know very, very well, well, that's easy. That's no big deal. So always think of Rahu as that point of life that our desires, our hopes, our cravings have led us to, that in this particular incarnation, we're meant to develop. And again, you want to go back to the previous talk on Rahu and the houses to figure out what that might mean for you. Ketu, on the other hand, this shows where we already have success, as I mentioned, and I want to, again, speak to the avatar of Ketu from this book. And the avatar of Ketu is Meena, which means the fish, or fish. And the way this story goes, again, we go into a little more detail within the Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology class, is that this king finds this small fish, and he takes pity on the fish and cups him up in his hands and puts him in a bowl. But every day, this fish grows bigger, so he puts him in a bowl, and the fish grows huge, and he can't stay in the bowl anymore. He puts him in a bathtub, the fish grows to the size of the bathtub. He puts him in a pond, the fish grows to the size of the pond. Until eventually, the king is overwhelmed, and he finally realizes who this fish is. It's Meena, or the avatar of Ketu. And that symbolizes that idea that wherever Ketu is placed, no matter how much attention you put to that area, it's always going to need something else. It's always going to need something more. You're never going to be satisfied with that area because you're going to try to get satisfaction of it that it just can't give you anymore. And again, from this book, the last paragraph on Meena, it says, Meena was a fish who was discontented with all smaller vessels except for the ocean of spirit. Similarly, Ketu is never contented with anything of the world and only finds contentment in spirit. Meena taught the knowledge of self-realization to Satyavrata and returned the wisdom of the Vedas. Ketu provides the knowledge of truth and is the producer of moksha and liberation. Whereas Rahu shows what we're meant to develop, but we're meant to go beyond our fears and just try. You might fail. There's no guarantee of success. And again, within the Bhagavad Gita, it does say that the yogi, or the spiritually inclined person, is entitled to action only, not to the fruits of their actions. Which means that if you're successful, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that you did it. That's what you're here to do. If you're obsessed with success, well, you're in the wrong world, because success comes, but usually there's 30 other failures before you get there, which is fine. But with Ketu, one thing I like to say about Ketu, and I tell this to all my clients, is that wherever Ketu is placed, that indicates the area of life where you have to treat that area as the unconditional aspect of God, or the divine consciousness. If Ketu's in the 7th house, if you think you're going to get satisfaction from your spouse, you're not. But if you can love your spouse as an incarnation of God, of the divine, with all of their failures, all their shortcomings, even the fact that they can't fulfill all of your desires and all your particular needs, if you can do that, that transforms your relationships, and you can have a good, loving, supportive relationship. Career, Ketu in the 10th. Your work. If you're looking for that one job that's going to make you feel so fulfilled, well, Ketu's not going to give it to you. But if you treat the work that you do have as service to God, the divine, the supreme infinite consciousness, you're doing your work. You are working with Ketu. You're finding that liberation. So always remember, wherever Ketu is placed, whatever house that is, figure out what does that house mean. And then whatever that house indicates, treat that area of your life as though how you interact with it is devotion to the divine consciousness. So you're not looking for exact, precise satisfaction like you want it. You're loving it for as it is. You're loving it as it is. And you're treating it as this divine infinite consciousness. There's a book I wrote called A Course in Tranquility. And in that book I write about one of the experiences I had at a meditation center that I was teaching at. And I noticed that when people came to this meditation center, and really any meditation centers, because I used to just frequent lots of groups anyway, that people were looking for something special. They were looking for God in a blaze of light. They were looking for God in this wide, encompassing aspect of peacefulness that would permeate their entire life. And God is everything, so it's even beyond peace. But what I realized is that if you meditate, or you practice spiritual techniques or spiritual practices, and you want God to show up in a particular way, that's like going up to someone you love, or someone coming up to you and saying, I will love you if you act in this particular way that I want you to. Think about that. Have you ever had anyone do that? How does that make you feel? So in the book, A Course in Tranquility, what I wrote about was how when you're meditating, if you can sit there quietly, peacefully, watching your thoughts arise, being aware of the room, being aware of whatever is in your consciousness, just watching it, and treating that, loving that as God. Well, that's like saying to the divine, I love you completely and unconditionally. Whether you're coming in a blaze of light or a fountain of love, or if it's just as simple as hearing the birds outside or watching the shadow cross the walls, the sun moves, just being silent in that room, loving it as it is. That's, in a sense, how you work with Ketu in a positive way. It's not asking God to be anything in particular to what you want, because that's where the obsession is going to come into play of Ketu. And that's where you're going to be disappointed and aggravated and agitated. So Ketu is that point of surrender, where you love that aspect of your life as it is. And that's the most important thing to remember about Ketu, loving that area of life where it's placed as it is. And with Rahu, going beyond your phobias, your fears, and doing what Rahu calls you to do. So think about the house Rahu is in. And what does that mean? If it's in the 10th house, developing your career, even if you don't want to. If it's in the 1st house, paying attention to your body, developing your personality, feeling strong in who you are, even if that feels weird to you. That's exactly what Rahu represents. And even if you fail in those areas of your life, it doesn't matter as long as you try. That's the point. You have to try. Failure, success, that's not the point. Rahu in the 2nd house, dealing with finances, putting more attention to your finances. That's what's called for. And we could go in more in regards to the nodes with the moon, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, all the planets, because when Rahu is with a planet, that shows that whatever that planet represents, that's an area or an energy of our life that we also have to develop that we're not good at. we have to develop discernment around that area. If it's Jupiter, for women, it's developing discernment around men or male figures within your life. If it's with Venus, that's around love, getting discernment around love, not having that where is my soulmate attitude, but seeing realistically, how do we develop a good loving relationship? If it's with Mars, Rahu shows the need to develop an effective, conscious use of our will and our logic. Because with Rahu and Mars together, our logic's not going to be so good, so we have to develop it. But this might be a topic for another class, which maybe we'll do this spring. It's actually on my agenda. So for now, just consider, what does Rahu and Ketu represent? What house is it in? What does that say about your path in life? That's the main thing. Okay. Rahu and Ketu is a very deep subject, which is why we need to do a whole class on it, I believe. So if you want to go to AshevilleVedicAstrology.com and follow that blog, or email me to be put on the mailing list, I'll announce when that class is going to happen. I think it'll be a good one. Because not only do you want to look at Rahu and Ketu within the birth chart, you also want to look at it within the Vargas. Because whatever house it's placed in within the Vargas is going to show what area within that Varga do we need to pay attention to in regards to Rahu and Ketu. So there's a lot you can tell about Rahu and Ketu. And when it comes to dashas, this is one reason why it's hard to predict dashas for Rahu and Ketu. Because they're not just like other planets. You have Mars in the 5th house. Well, you look at Mars in the 5th house, see what house Mars rules, figure out what that means. When that dasha comes, that's going to be the main focus. With Rahu and Ketu, it's not only Rahu in the house, but it's also where is the Lord of Rahu and Ketu. Within all the Vargas, who rules Rahu and Ketu? What house does that go in? So Rahu and Ketu are quite vast subjects in and of themselves and take a lot of study, which is why a lot of people get Rahu and Ketu dashas wrong, because there's so much to look at. And that's no fault to the astrologer. There's a lot to look at. So it takes a lot of time to consider these things. But let's consider some other more concrete aspects of Rahu and Ketu. So Rahu is said to behave like Saturn, which means that when you go into a Rahu period, you can also consider Saturn's placement, because Rahu acts like Saturn. Ketu is said to behave like Mars, which means when you go into a Ketu period, you also need to assess what is Mars doing. You can do Rahu mantras on Saturdays, because Rahu and Saturn are similar. You can do Ketu mantras beginning on Tuesdays, because Mars and Ketu are similar. Rahu can indicate a person in diplomatic jobs, or jobs dealing with foreigners or foreign things, or even strange things, out of the ordinary things. Rahu typically, when he's negative, deals with manipulating facts, dealings that involve drugs or poisons, cheats, pleasure seekers, insincere or immoral acts. And Rahu can push us to the limits. So we can push ourselves too far wherever Rahu is, because we don't have a sense of our limits, because we've not done it before. Which is why whenever we have Rahu with a particular planet or in a particular house, I almost always tell people it's that area of life that you need to get some outside advice on. So you don't want to trust yourself with that. Just like if you have an alcoholic who can't trust himself to know whether he should drive home or not. If he knows that, he can go to his friend and say, I've had something to drink, should I drive home? The friend can say, it looks like you're drunk, so no. Same thing with Rahu. Whatever house that's in, it's that area of life that we need to get outside advice on, because we might not necessarily be able to trust ourselves because we don't have enough experience there. Rahu can also indicate a person who's just different than their culture, which is why Rahu is said to relate to outcasts. Because Rahu is the pioneer. He pushes the boundaries. And that's not always bad, except in a traditional society it can be, because if it wasn't for Rahu, we wouldn't have a lot of the inventions that we have. We wouldn't have broken out of a lot of the societal molds that kept us in dogmatic thinking. Rahu seems bad, and he is bad when he's in bad dignity. But when he's in good dignity, or has a lord who's in good dignity, that shows someone who's breaking the mold or breaking the boundaries to create more growth, to create better opportunities, who sees something that we just can't see, possibilities that we just can't see. It's when Rahu's in bad dignity that the person might think they're being a pioneer, or think that they are challenging society in a positive way, but really they're confused and they're just being maybe an extremist or a fanatic. So there's a fine line with Rahu. Rahu represents our worldly desires, and it shows where our karmas are most easily converted into deeds, into action. Rahu represents the mind, because Rahu is just ahead. He's just ahead of this demon. And again, in the Myth and Magic class, we go into the mythology, but you can also Google it. But anyway, Rahu is just ahead. And so it shows the head energy detached from the heart energy, which is why when Rahu is strong in a person's chart, they can be very intelligent and even cut off from their emotions. And they can be very manipulative because they're thinking, they're planning, they're scheming. They have this sort of energy of trying to get around the rules, break the rules. Again, that might be more when Rahu's in bad dignity. When Rahu's in good dignity, the person can really understand things very deeply, very arcane things as well. Rahu typically is related to materialism, which is kind of interesting because I don't know too much about Western astrology, but I think the north node of the moon is typically said to be a good position, or a good energy, because it shows success in the material world. And in Vedic astrology, it's the opposite, because it's the worldly things that get us in trouble. And Ketu is considered to be the good thing because that leads us to greater self-knowledge. So when Rahu is too emphasized within a person's chart, it can give us insatiable desires and too much focus on worldly accomplishments and confusion about how to achieve those things. Rahu's element is air, and we always have to remember that Rahu is modified by its lord and by the planets that it's with. Now Ketu. As we mentioned, Ketu is said to behave like Mars. On a very mundane level, Ketu represents mass catastrophes and wars, epidemics, bacteria. It represents psychic forces within the subconscious and compulsive behavior because it's coming from past lives. We might not understand it. We might act in a certain way because of Ketu, and we just wonder, where does that come from? Because it's coming from something beyond our conscious mind, which is why through meditation and yoga practice, Ketu starts to work better, because we start to understand the consciousness. We start to understand where these things are coming from, the deeper aspects of ourselves. So essentially, Ketu can represent invisible forces from our past. It can represent viruses, epidemics, diseases, wars. And since it's like Mars, it can also represent injury. And I've seen Mars and Ketu together influencing people who deal with electricity or who get electrocuted or things of that nature, which is kind of fascinating. So Ketu is also a planet of rebirth and regeneration, spiritual rebirth and spiritual regeneration. So if we can understand Ketu's position within the chart, we can understand where our wisdom, where our discrimination, how to develop non-attachment to worldly desires. That can be the key or the link in the chain that can really unlock our spiritual progress. When Ketu is strong, it can make a person shy away from worldly things, can make them more internalized, make them more focused on moksha, although if it's not well placed, it can make them more prone to escapism, which is often true in spiritual seekers. They say they're looking for enlightenment, but really what they're looking for is escape from the world. And that's not going to result in enlightenment. We have to remember that. So Ketu allows us to have the discernment, the knowledge, to realize what true renunciation is. It's not running away. It's not escaping. It's seeing the world as it is, as a manifestation of our thoughts, habits, desires, cravings, hopes, and then letting go of that and letting the karma exhaust itself, which is fairly hard. It's not an easy thing, which is why there are very few people pursuing spirituality who seem to be successful. And those people who are successful, you don't know, because they're not acting any differently. And they know internally what's what, and they don't make a big deal about it. So it's an interesting thing. So Ketu can inspire us to regain our original enlightened state. It has the capacity to lead us out of the maze of material illusion and frees us from our delusions, which we desperately cling to. Most people desperately cling to their delusions. And that's part of the path, which is what makes it so hard. but what's called for. So mantras to Ketu, even Ganesh can help. I've read that Ganesh and Ketu are considered to be related in a way, because Ketu is the body of a demon, so it's no head, it's just heart energy, pure heart energy. If you remember, Ganesh has an elephant's head, because he had his head either cut off, depending on what story you read, cut off, or in one story that Saturn actually annihilated Ganesh's head, and then they had to find another head to put on, which is where the elephant head came into play. So just like Ganesh can represent wisdom and the removal of these obstacles, Ketu can also represent wisdom and the removal of these obstacles. Now, some other physical things to consider. Rahu can be related to spies and deceptive people, drug dealers, poisons, insincere or immoral acts, as we've said, venomous and bitter speech. It can make a person heretical, unconventional or unorthodox, southwestern direction. And always remember that heretical people or unorthodox people, they're not always wrong. They're not always accepted until later. And that's how Rahu works. It makes a person ahead of their time, and then say many years go by and finally someone says, oh yes, I think that person actually was right. So if you have a strong Rahu, you might not fit into your family. You might be ahead of the time of your family or your community. And if Rahu's in a difficult placement or bad dignity, well, that might indicate someone who's just heretical or unorthodox for the sake of being difficult. But if it's in a good placement, there might be something there. So if you're ever looking at someone's chart and you see Rahu prominently placed and the Lord's in good dignity and it's with good dignity planets, they might seem a little strange, but you might want to pay attention to them. Ketu represents psychic influences, which can include ghosts and spirits, the practice of witchcraft, black magic, deals with serpents and snake charmers. Ketu is associated with holes, caves, tunnels, and darkness, hypersensitivity, knowledge of spiritual matters, bathing in sacred rivers, liberation and salvation. Ketu in the first or Ketu in the fifth, that can make a person oversensitive, hypersensitive, either physically hypersensitive because of the body, or make the mind hypersensitive. Ketu in the eighth can make our deeper consciousness hypersensitive, so it can be good for psychic things, but we have to be aware of this. And so if we see someone who has this, we might need to counsel them to be a little more grounded, a little more aware of their psychic influences and dealing with them, because they might be overwhelmed by psychic things and they don't even know it, so it makes them seem like they're crazy, but really they just haven't found their center yet and learn how to cast out those things which are tuning into them, which they don't need. So it's really a fascinating topic. So these are some ideas of Rahu and Ketu. Again, you want to either go back and listen to previous talks on Rahu and Ketu in regards to the houses. It's a good point to start. And then if you're interested, you can take a look at the Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology course on my website, which goes into detail of these planets to learn more. But they're well worth studying. They're not easy. They can be confusing. It's the nature of the nodes. But the more you learn about Rahu and Ketu, the more you understand your own self, your own fears, phobias, why you're here, the things you need to get over, the things you have to go through to let go of your things that hold you back, your self-doubts, and just try to be successful in the areas of Rahu and try to let go of those things related to Ketu. And that's how you find peace, which again, going back to that idea that yogically speaking, letting go of the future, Rahu, letting go of the past, Ketu, and you don't have to worry about Rahu and Ketu because they don't exist then, which is the state of liberated individuals. But that's not an easy state to find. It's worth it. So if you're inspired, do it. If you're not, and you're still dealing with Rahu and Ketu, finding yourself a good psychologist to work with to deal with the issues, a good coach to inspire you, to challenge you to move through the difficulties of Rahu and Ketu. This is some of the best ways to work with and energize these energies within you.